An elderly woman sat alone on a hospital bench in the dead of night. The January air was bitter cold, and her breath rose in white clouds. She wore a thin blanket from a donation bin and shoes with holes at the toes. 4 floors above her, her 6-year-old granddaughter lay in the pediatric intensive care unit, connected to a ventilator. The hospital had refused to let the grandmother inside. She had no identification, no insurance, and no permanent address. To the staff, she was simply an unauthorized visitor. A doctor stepped outside for a moment of air and noticed her sitting there. He almost kept walking. He almost called security, as the system usually did with people who slept on hospital benches at night. But something made him stop. The woman sat upright, her back straight, clutching a small composition notebook against her chest, as if it were the most precious thing she owned. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need medical help?" Helen Whitaker looked up at him. Her eyes were tired, but clear and sharp. "I am fine. Is my granddaughter all right? Room 412, Lila Whitaker." Dr. Julian Hayes knew the room. A 6-year-old girl with acute myocarditis had been there for weeks. The chart listed no emergency contact and no family on file. The nurses had noted that the child sometimes cried for her grandmother at night, but no one had ever appeared during visiting hours to claim her. And here was the grandmother, not inside the hospital but outside it, in the freezing cold. "How long have you been out here?" Helen looked at him the way someone looks when the answer is too heavy to speak quickly. "Many long weeks." Julian felt something shift inside him. He looked at the notebook in her hands. "May I?" Helen hesitated, then handed it over. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, the knuckles swollen, the skin cracked and dry. These were not the hands of someone who had given up. These were the hands of someone who had been holding on with everything she had. He opened the first page. The handwriting was shaky but careful, each letter formed with intention. The pages recorded Lila's condition in fragments gathered from the outside, a question asked through a closing door, a glimpse through the ICU window, a detail overheard in the hallway. Helen had built an entire medical log from the other side of a building she was not allowed to enter. Some entries were clinical, others were deeply personal. One page simply read that Lila had smiled for the first time in weeks. Another said she had drawn a picture of their old apartment and placed her grandmother in the window. Another asked whether her grandmother had forgotten her. The ink on several pages was smeared from water damage. Julian looked at the open sky above the bench and understood. It had rained many times during those long weeks. Helen had sat through every storm. Hospitals in America have rules: visiting hours, identification requirements, insurance verification. These policies exist for valid reasons: security, patient safety, infection control. But they also create invisible walls that keep certain people out. People without a permanent address. People without government-issued identification. People whose relationship to a patient cannot be confirmed through a database. Helen Whitaker was Lila's grandmother. She had raised the child since she was 2 years old. She was the only family Lila had ever truly known. But the system could not see that. The system saw an unverified visitor with no documentation. And so, the system placed a glass door between a grandmother and her gravely ill granddaughter and told Helen to come back during approved hours with proper identification. Helen came back every single day. She simply never left. Julian closed the notebook and looked at her. She was watching him with the expression of someone waiting to be dismissed. He handed the notebook back. "You have been out here for many long weeks." "She is my granddaughter," Helen said simply. And that explained everything. Helen Whitaker had not chosen to be homeless. She had not chosen to lose her husband, her home, or her savings. She had not chosen for her daughter to disappear into addiction or for her granddaughter to fall so ill. But she had chosen one thing every single day. She had chosen to stay. To understand how Helen ended up on that bench, one must go back many years to a classroom in West Baltimore. A young woman named Helen Turner stood in front of 23 four-year-olds on her first day as a preschool teacher. She was 22, freshly graduated from college with a degree in early childhood education and a deep, unshakable belief that every child deserved someone who showed up for them, not just sometimes, but every day. That belief came from her own grandmother, Mama Pearl, who had raised Helen after her mother left. Mama Pearl cleaned office buildings at night, and braided hair on weekends, yet she never let Helen go to school without a pressed uniform and a packed lunch, even when that lunch was only a biscuit and a piece of fruit. "You do not let a child see the struggle," Mama Pearl used to say. "You let a child see the love." Helen carried that lesson into every classroom she taught. For decades at Garrison Elementary, she was the teacher who arrived early, learned every child's name quickly, and kept a drawer full of clean socks and granola bars for children who came to school without breakfast. She married Walter Whitaker when she was 28. He was a quiet, steady man who drove a sanitation truck for the city for 26 years. They bought a modest row house on Reisterstown Road. Helen cooked Sunday dinner for anyone who needed a plate. They had one daughter, Tasha, and Tasha broke their hearts. It began in high school with painkillers after a sports injury, then something stronger, then something that swallowed her whole. Helen and Walter tried everything: rehab, counseling, tough love, soft love, prayer. Nothing held for long. Tasha would get clean for months, relapse, disappear, and return thinner and harder each time. When Lila was born, Tasha was 23 and already too far gone to hold a baby steadily. Helen was in the delivery room. She cut the cord. She took Lila home from the hospital 2 days later and never brought her back. Tasha signed informal custody papers at a check-cashing store. Nothing legal, just a notarized note saying Helen would care for Lila until Tasha got better. Tasha never got better. Then Walter became ill with lung cancer, discovered late. 8 months of chemotherapy and 3 surgeries followed. He died on a Tuesday morning in October, holding Helen's hand and whispering that he was sorry for leaving her with so much to carry. The hospital bills reached nearly $200,000. Even with Medicare and supplemental insurance, the out-of-pocket costs consumed everything: the savings, the emergency fund, the small life insurance policy meant to be Helen's safety net. Helen's teacher pension was modest. Rent on the row house consumed most of it. She held on for 3 years, cutting every expense she could, wearing the same few outfits in rotation, keeping the heat off until the temperature dropped below freezing. But a fixed income cannot stretch indefinitely when medical debt grows faster than it can be paid. The eviction notice arrived 6 months before Lila became ill. Helen packed their belongings into garbage bags and a rolling suitcase with a broken wheel. She and Lila lived in their old Honda Civic for 2 months, parking in church lots and using gas station sinks to wash. When the car finally broke down and could not be repaired, they entered a shelter. The shelter gave them a bed for 90 days. After that, the waiting list for permanent housing stretched more than a year, and Helen was running out of options. Through it all, every single day, she made sure Lila's hair was braided, her clothes were clean, and her homework was done. She carried a box of crayons everywhere because Lila loved to draw, and Helen believed a child who could still draw still had hope. A social worker once asked why Helen did not place Lila in foster care, even temporarily. Helen looked at her with decades of teaching in her eyes and said the words she would carry forever. "A child does not need to know she is poor. She just needs to know she is loved." Lila Whitaker was 6 years old and loved three things above all else: drawing, butterflies, and her grandmother. She had her grandmother's wide smile and her mother's sharp cheekbones and a laugh that seemed too large for her small body. She talked to strangers in grocery stores, named every stray cat she saw, and asked questions no adult could answer. She did not know she was homeless. Helen had made sure of that. To Lila, they were simply on an adventure. The shelter was a hotel. The car had been a camping trip. The backpack with all her clothes was what explorers carried. Helen had turned hardship into a game so her granddaughter would never feel its weight. But the body does not play games, and Lila's body had been sending warnings for weeks. It began with unusual tiredness. Lila, who never sat still, suddenly wanted to rest after walking half a block. Then came shortness of breath. She would climb stairs and stop on the landing, hands on her knees, her lips tinged with a blue-gray color Helen had never seen before. One Thursday afternoon in the shelter common room, Lila stood up to show Helen a drawing, took 2 steps, and collapsed. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. Her skin was gray. Her small hands were ice cold. Helen did not scream or panic. She dropped to the floor, cradled Lila's head in her lap, and called 911 with the calm voice of someone who had spent decades being the steady adult when others fell apart. The ambulance arrived quickly. Paramedics took Lila to Manhattan Children's Hospital with sirens cutting through traffic. Helen sat in the back, holding her granddaughter's hand, whispering the same words over and over. "Grandma is here. Grandma is right here. You are going to be just fine." At the hospital, everything moved fast. Too fast. Lila was wheeled into the emergency department. Doctors surrounded her. Words Helen did not fully understand flew back and forth. Acute myocarditis, ventricular dysfunction, critically low ejection fraction. What Helen understood was this: her granddaughter's heart was inflamed and not pumping blood properly. A virus Lila had caught weeks earlier, which Helen had thought was only a cold, had attacked the heart muscle. Now that heart was failing. Lila was moved to the pediatric ICU, room 412. She was connected to a ventilator, heart monitor, and IV tantiamu lines. Machines beeped. Lines ran from her small body to screens showing numbers Helen could not read but watched anyway, as if staring hard enough might keep them safe. Myocarditis in children is rare but real. It can follow an ordinary viral infection. The virus settles into the heart muscle, triggers inflammation, and in severe cases, the heart swells so much it can no longer pump effectively. Most children recover with medication and time. Some need mechanical support. A few need new hearts. Lila was somewhere between the second and third categories, and the doctors would not know which way it would go for weeks. Helen followed the gurney through the ICU doors. She was right behind it, close enough to touch the railing of Lila's bed, close enough to hear her whimpering through the oxygen mask. Then a hand stopped her. "Ma'am, I need to see your identification and insurance information." Helen reached into her bag. She had Lila's Medicaid card, enrolled through the shelter's emergency program. But when the registration clerk asked for Helen's own ID, her own address, and proof of legal relationship to the patient, Helen had nothing the system could verify. No current government-issued identification. Her old license had expired years earlier. No permanent address, no formal guardianship papers, only a crumpled notarized note from a daughter who had not been seen in over a year. The clerk made a phone call, then looked up with an expression that was not unkind but very firm. "I am sorry, ma'am. Until we can verify your relationship to the patient, we can only allow supervised visits during regular visiting hours, 2 hours a day out of 24. That was what the system had decided Helen deserved. She could hear Lila through the glass, small and frightened, calling the only word that mattered. "Grandma? Grandma, where are you?" Helen stood on the other side of the ICU door and pressed her palm flat against the glass. Through that glass, she could see Lila in the bed, small and tangled in wires, reaching her hand toward the door. Their palms were inches apart, separated by a quarter-inch of hospital glass. That glass door became Helen's entire world, and for many long weeks, she never left the other side of it. Helen's days settled into a rhythm, not the rhythm of someone living, but of someone waiting. She woke early on the same bench, third from the main entrance, partially sheltered by an awning so the rain hit only her legs. She folded the donation blanket neatly and tucked it into her plastic bag. She smoothed her coat, fixed her hair with a comb from her pocket, and walked several blocks to the subway station, not to ride, but to use the bathroom. She washed her face, changed her shirt from the plastic bag, and brushed her teeth with a worn travel toothbrush. She looked at herself in the scratched metal mirror and made sure she looked like someone who belonged somewhere, because Helen Whitaker refused to look like what she was. She did not want pity. She wanted to be at the hospital door when visiting hours began. At 7 o'clock, the glass doors opened. Helen walked in, signed the visitor log with steady hands, took the elevator to the 4th floor, and sat with Lila for exactly 1 hour. She combed Lila's hair. She told her stories. She held up drawings Lila had made the day before and taped new paper to the bed tray so Lila could draw more. She checked the monitors, memorized the numbers, and asked the nurse what medications had changed. At 8 o'clock, a nurse would say visiting hours were over. Helen would kiss Lila's forehead, promise to return later, and walk back out through the glass doors. Then she returned to the bench. For hours, she sat outside the hospital. She sat while ambulances screamed past. She sat while taxis pulled up and parents rushed in carrying stuffed animals, balloons, and gift bags. She sat while couples walked in holding hands, wearing clean clothes, smelling of coffee shops, carrying the confidence of people whose biggest problem that day was a broken arm or a bad fever, things that would heal, things that had timelines. Helen carried the composition notebook and a box of crayons. That was her luggage. She wrote in the notebook between visits, recording everything. What the nurse said about oxygen levels, what time the doctors did rounds, whether Lila ate breakfast, whether she slept through the night. She gathered this information in fragments through brief conversations with nurses who were sometimes kind, sometimes too busy, and sometimes annoyed that this woman kept asking questions she technically had no authorization to receive answers to. When she was not writing, she knitted. She had found a ball of yellow yarn in a donation bin at a nearby church and a pair of knitting needles at a thrift store for 75 cents. She was making Lila a scarf, yellow because Lila said yellow was the color of happy. Helen's hands moved the needles in the cold, her fingers stiff and cracked, the yarn looping slowly into rows that grew an inch each day. In the United States, more than 2.5 million children experience homelessness every year. In a growing number of those cases, the person holding the family together is not a parent, but a grandparent. Nearly 2.7 million grandparents across the country are raising their grandchildren, many without legal custody, without financial support, and without formal recognition from the systems meant to protect families. They fall into a gap no one designed on purpose, but no one has fixed. Too old for certain aid programs, too informal to qualify for legal rights, too invisible to be counted in the ways that matter. Helen was one of those 2.7 million. And like most of them, she did not have a voice loud enough for anyone to hear. The security guard noticed her on the 3rd day. His name was Darius, 29 years old, broad-shouldered, and quiet. He walked over on his first shift and told Helen she could not loiter on hospital property. Helen looked up at him. "I am waiting for visiting hours." "Visiting hours are not for 9 more hours, ma'am. You cannot sit here all day." "I will be quiet. I will not bother anyone." Darius hesitated, then walked away. The next day, he told her the same thing. By the end of the first week, he had stopped telling her to leave and simply ignored her, which Helen understood was its own kind of permission. By the second week, something shifted. Darius would walk past the bench on his rounds and glance at her. He noticed she was always in the same spot, never asked for money, never talked to anyone, never left except to use the bathroom and return. She sat straight, kept her area clean, and folded her blanket every morning. She was not behaving like someone who had nowhere to go. She was behaving like someone who had chosen exactly where to be. One morning, Darius walked past the bench before visiting hours. He did not look at Helen. He set a paper cup of coffee on the far edge of the bench and kept walking. Helen picked it up. It was hot and black, no sugar. She wrapped both hands around it and held it against her chest. Neither of them said a word. Darius brought coffee every morning after that, and every morning neither of them said a word about it. Some kindness does not need a conversation. It only needs a cup, and the willingness to see someone the rest of the world has decided not to look at. Now, to understand what happened next, one must understand the man who found Helen on that bench. Because Dr. Julian Hayes did not stop by accident. He stopped because something in that image broke through the wall he had been building around himself for years. Julian Hayes was 38 years old, a pediatric ICU attending at Manhattan Children's Hospital, board certified, published, respected by colleagues. On paper, he was everything a doctor should be. In reality, he was falling apart. He had not slept more than 4 hours a night in months. His marriage was held together by logistics, not love. His wife, a corporate attorney, had stopped asking when he was coming home because the answer was always later. They communicated through text messages about grocery lists and who was picking up their daughter from daycare. They slept in the same bed, but might as well have been in different buildings. Julian had not become a doctor because he wanted to. He became a doctor because he had promised. He grew up on the south side of Chicago in a neighborhood where sirens were constant background noise. His mother had been addicted to crack cocaine. She left when Julian was 4. Just gone one morning, the door open, the apartment cold, a box of cereal spilled on the kitchen floor. Julian remembered the cereal more than he remembered her face. His grandmother raised him. Everyone in the neighborhood called her Miss Ruth. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning rooms at a Holiday Inn by day and doing laundry at a nursing home by night. Her hands were always dry, always cracked, always smelling of bleach and fabric softener. She wore the same 3 church dresses in rotation and kept her Bible on the kitchen table like other people keep a salt shaker. Miss Ruth had one rule: homework before anything else. She did not care about basketball or video games or what the other boys on the block were doing. You come home, you sit at this table, and you do your work. That is how you get out. That is how you become something. Julian did his homework every single night at that kitchen table, and Miss Ruth sat across from him folding laundry or reading her Bible, simply being there. Present, constant. The way grandmothers are when they have decided a child will not fall through the cracks on their watch. "Make something of yourself," she told him once while pressing his church shirt the night before a scholarship interview. "Make something so you can help people who look like us, people nobody else is going to help." Julian earned the scholarship, then another, then medical school, residency, fellowship, and finally a position at one of the best pediatric hospitals in the country. He made something of himself. Miss Ruth never saw it. She died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning during Julian's second year of college. She collapsed in the laundry room of the nursing home where she worked nights. They found her on the floor between two washing machines, still holding a folded sheet. Julian had carried that image for 16 years. The grandmother who gave him everything, dying alone on a concrete floor in a building full of people who did not know her name. And now, on a frozen January night, Julian had stepped outside because he could not sleep. Because he had lost a 4-year-old patient named Elijah 6 days earlier. Because he was questioning whether any of this mattered. Whether saving some children only to lose others was a career or a punishment. He stepped outside to breathe. And he saw a 71-year-old woman on a bench. Same age as Miss Ruth when she died. Same dark skin. Same posture. Sitting upright even in exhaustion. Back straight. Chin level. The posture of a woman who had been taught that dignity was something you wore, not something you earned. His feet would not move. His brain said, walk past. His body said, stop. He stopped, and that is why Julian Hayes sat down on that bench instead of walking past it. Not because he was a hero, not because he was extraordinarily kind, because he saw his grandmother, and his body remembered what it felt like to be loved by someone who had nothing except the decision to show up. Julian sat down beside Helen, not standing over her, not crouching like one does with a child. He sat beside her the way one sits next to someone chosen as an equal. It was a small thing, but Helen noticed. She had spent many weeks being looked past or looked down upon. Doctors, nurses, visitors, delivery drivers, even other people experiencing homelessness, had walked by without truly seeing her. This man sat next to her. I am one of her doctors, Julian said. Room 412, Lila Whitaker. Helen's whole body changed. Her shoulders came forward. Her hands tightened on the notebook. Her eyes, which had been guarded, suddenly flooded with everything she had been holding back. Is she okay? Is she worse? They changed her medication on Tuesday. The new one. Is it working? She has been coughing more at night. I can hear it sometimes from outside when the windows are cracked. Is that the infection or the fluid? Julian stared at her. This woman on a bench in freezing weather was asking clinical questions. Specific, informed, detailed. Questions that some parents who sat in the ICU family lounge all day never thought to ask. How do you know about the medication change? I asked the nurses during visiting hours. Some of them tell me things, some do not. I write it all down. She held up the notebook. Julian had already seen it. But now, under the yellow glow of the hospital lights, Helen opened it to a random page and handed it to him. He read entries about temperatures, oxygen levels, small improvements, and Lila asking about her mother. He read about a butterfly drawing taped to the window so Lila could see it from her bed. He read about Lila crying at 2 a.m. and wanting only her grandmother, while Helen sat 20 feet away, unable to reach her because she was not in the system. Julian closed the notebook. He did not close it because he was finished reading. He closed it because his hands were shaking and he did not want Helen to see. He had read thousands of medical charts, clinical, efficient, precise. But he had never read anything like this notebook. This was not a medical chart. This was a grandmother's love translated into data. Every temperature reading was an act of vigilance. Every medication note was a refusal to be left out. Every small detail was proof that someone on the other side of a glass door was paying closer attention than anyone inside it. You have been out here for many long weeks, Julian said quietly. She is all I have, Helen answered. And I am all she has. Julian looked at the hospital. 4 stories up, behind a window he could not see from this angle, a 6-year-old girl was sleeping alone in a room full of machines, and her grandmother was sitting right here. My grandmother raised me too, Julian said. Helen looked at him. really looked at him. For the first time in many weeks, someone was not talking to her like a problem. Someone was talking to her like a person. What was her name? Ruth. Miss Ruth. She sounds like a good woman. She was the best woman I ever knew. They sat in silence for a moment. The kind of silence that is not empty, but full. The kind that happens when two people recognize something in each other that does not need explanation. Then Julian stood up. "Come with me." Helen looked at him, confused and cautious. She had learned that when people in authority say, "Follow me," it usually means one is about to be told no in a different room. "Where?" "Room 412. It is the middle of the night. Visiting hours do not start until morning." "I know," Julian said. "Come with me anyway." What Dr. Hayes did next broke every rule in that hospital and started a chain of events no one, not the administrators, not the lawyers, not even Helen herself, could have predicted. Julian swiped his badge at the ICU entrance. The lock clicked. The heavy door swung open. And Helen Whitaker walked into the pediatric intensive care unit for the first time in many long weeks, outside of visiting hours. The unit was quiet, the particular quiet that only hospitals have at night, where fluorescent lights hum, monitors beep in slow rhythms, and the hallway feels like it is holding its breath. Two nurses sat at the central station. One looked up, saw Julian, saw the elderly woman beside him, and opened her mouth to speak. Julian shook his head slightly. The nurse closed her mouth. They walked to room 412. Julian opened the door slowly. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of monitors and a small nightlight shaped like a moon that one of the nurses had brought because Lila was afraid of the dark. Leela was asleep, small and still under a white hospital blanket, her braids fanned out on the pillow, her chest rising and falling with the ventilator's rhythm. Wires ran from her chest to machines. An IV line snaked from her hand. She looked fragile in the way only sick children look fragile, as if the weight of the sheets might be too much. Helen stopped in the doorway. She did not rush in. She stood there, one hand gripping the doorframe, and simply looked at her granddaughter. Not through glass, not from a bench 4 stories below. She looked at Lila the way one looks at something one thought one might never see again up close. Then she walked to the bed. She sat in the chair beside it, and she reached out and took Lila's hand. It was the first time she had touched her granddaughter in many long weeks without a sheet of glass between them. Helen's hand, rough, cold, and cracked from weeks of sleeping outside, wrapped around Lila's small, warm, IV-bruised fingers. Helen did not cry. She did not make a sound. She simply held that hand, closed her eyes, and began to hum, low, barely audible, a melody Julian did not recognize but that Lila's body seemed to know. Something changed on the monitors. Julian saw it happen. The heart rate, which had been fluctuating for days, began to settle into a steadier rhythm, the most stable reading the child had shown in many long weeks. There is published peer-reviewed research showing that the presence of a familiar caregiver with a strong emotional bond can stabilize heart rate, lower cortisol levels, reduce agitation, and improve recovery outcomes in critically ill children. The body recognizes safety before the mind does. And Lila's body recognized her grandmother's hand, her grandmother's voice, her grandmother's specific and irreplaceable presence. The machines knew what the system did not. This woman belonged here. Julian stood in the doorway and watched. He did not interrupt. He did not check the monitors up close. He did not do anything medical at all. He simply let a grandmother hold her granddaughter's hand in a dark room in the middle of the night. He stood there for 15 minutes. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Nurse Clara Goodwin, 55 years old, and 31 years in pediatric nursing, had seen everything, every kind of parent, every kind of loss, every kind of miracle. She ran the night shift with precision and an iron commitment to protocol that had earned her the respect of every doctor and the fear of every new resident. She looked past Julian into room 412. She saw Helen. She saw the hand-holding. She saw the monitors. She did not need Julian to explain. She could read the numbers. She could see that this child, who had been restless and unstable for weeks, was now sleeping peacefully. Clara looked at Julian. Julian looked at Clara. Neither spoke. Clara turned and walked back to the nursing station. She did not raise her voice. She did not call security. She sat down, opened the patient chart, and noted the time. But the next morning, she filed a report. Because Clara Goodwin followed the rules, that was who she was. And the rules said that an unverified visitor in the ICU outside approved hours, regardless of outcome, was an incident requiring documentation. She did it without anger. She did it without malice. She did it because she believed systems only work when people follow them. And she was not wrong about that, but she was not entirely right either. Because sometimes the system is the problem. And sometimes the people who break the rules are the only ones who see it. The call came early the next morning. Julian had not slept. He was still in his scrubs, sitting in the break room with a cold cup of coffee, replaying the image of Helen holding Lila's hand in that dark room. His phone buzzed. Conference room B. Now. He knew what it was about. He had known since Clara walked away from the doorway without a word. He had known, and he had done it anyway. The conference room was small and windowless. 3 people were already seated when Julian walked in. Thomas Langford, the hospital administrator, 58, in a gray suit with reading glasses perched on his nose. The kind of man who spent his career making sure institutions ran smoothly and lawsuits did not happen. Karen Mitchell, head of legal, younger and sharper, a yellow legal pad already covered in notes. And Dr. Nadia Okoro, chief of pediatrics, 62, silver-haired, sitting at the far end of the table with her hands folded and her expression unreadable. Dr. Hayes, Thomas began, at approximately 3:30 this morning, you used your employee badge to grant access to the pediatric ICU to an individual who is not listed as an authorized visitor, family member, or legal guardian of any patient on this floor. Is that correct? Yes, Julian said. Karen leaned forward. The individual in question is Helen Whitaker. She has no verified legal relationship to the patient in room 412. No current government-issued identification. No permanent address. She is, for all legal purposes, an unverified stranger. She is that child's grandmother, Julian said. She has been raising her for 6 years. We have no documentation confirming that, Karen said. She has many weeks of documentation confirming that. Thomas removed his glasses and set them on the table. Dr. Hayes, you brought an unverified individual into a pediatric intensive care unit in the middle of the night without authorization, without security clearance, without informing the charge nurse. Do you understand the liability implications? I understand that a 6-year-old girl has been in that unit for many long weeks without a single family visit outside of 2 restricted hours, Julian said. I understand that her grandmother has been sleeping on a bench outside this hospital in January because our system will not let her through the door. And I understand that last night, when that woman held her granddaughter's hand for the first time in many long weeks, that child's cardiac function improved more in 1 hour than it has in 3 weeks of our protocols. That is not a medical justification for a security breach, Karen said. It is a medical observation, Julian replied. The room was quiet for a moment. Thomas looked at Karen. Karen looked at her legal pad. Neither looked at Dr. Okoro, who had not said a single word since Julian walked in. Dr. Okoro spoke for the first time. The child's cardiac function improved 12% overnight. Her voice was calm and precise. First measurable improvement in 3 weeks. I reviewed the chart this morning. I would like to know what changed. No one answered. Dr. Okoro looked at Julian, then at Thomas, then at Karen. I would like to know, she repeated. What changed? And she let the silence sit there, heavy, unanswered. A question none of them could address without admitting something the institution was not ready to admit. That a grandmother on a bench might have done more for that child in 1 hour than many weeks of restricted visiting policy had accomplished. The consequences did not stop with Julian. They rolled downhill the way consequences always do in systems designed to protect themselves, and they landed on the person who had the least power to absorb them. Helen was sitting on her bench when a hospital security officer approached her. Not Darius, but a different guard, older, holding a clipboard. He asked for her visitor badge. Helen unclipped it from her coat and handed it over. She had worn that badge every day for many long weeks. It was laminated, with her photo taken the first day at registration, her face tired but composed. It said, "Visitor, restricted, escort required." It was not much, but it was the only proof she had that the system acknowledged she existed in relation to Lila at all. The guard took the badge and told Helen that her visitor privileges had been suspended pending an administrative review. She was not to enter the hospital until further notice. Helen sat very still. "When can I see my granddaughter?" "That will be determined by the administration, ma'am." He walked away. Helen watched him go. She did not call after him. She did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with people holding clipboards never changed the answer. It only made them write something down about you. A few days later, the letter came. It was addressed to Helen Whitaker, care of Manhattan Children's Hospital, the only address anyone had for her. A nurse who had grown fond of Helen brought it outside and handed it to her quietly. The letter was from the New York City Department of Human Services. It was printed on official letterhead, dense with legal language. Words Helen recognized individually, but not in the combinations they were arranged in. Adjudication, petition, custodial determination, welfare assessment. But she understood enough. She understood the phrase, removal of custody. She understood foster care placement. She understood in the best interest of the child. DHS had opened a case. Someone somewhere in the chain of reports had flagged the situation. A 6-year-old child in a pediatric ICU, primary caregiver, is homeless, no legal guardianship, no stable housing, no income documentation. The system had done what systems do. It had identified a problem and activated a process. The process was designed to protect children. Helen understood that. She did not blame the system for existing. She blamed it for not seeing what was right in front of it. Helen sat on the bench. She held the letter in her left hand and the notebook in her right, the notebook with many pages of proof that she had not missed a single day, that she knew her granddaughter's temperature, her medications, her moods, her fears, her favorite color, the name of the nurse who sang to her at night. Many pages that said, "I was here. I was paying attention. I never left." The letter said none of that mattered without the right paperwork. Helen folded the letter carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, the same pocket where she kept Lila's spare hair ties and a small photograph of the two of them at a church picnic the summer before. Lila on Helen's lap, both of them laughing at something the camera did not capture. She did not cry. She had not cried in many long weeks, and she was not going to start now. Crying was a luxury for people who had time to fall apart. Helen did not have time. She had a granddaughter 4 floors above her who was sick and scared and alone, and now the state was considering taking that child away and placing her with strangers. Helen looked at the notebook. She pressed her hand flat against its cover the way she had pressed her hand against the glass door of the ICU. "A child does not need to know she is poor," she said quietly. To no one. To herself. To Mama Pearl. To the cold January air. She just needs to know she is loved. Helen had survived poverty, grief, addiction in her family, and homelessness. But nothing had prepared her for the possibility of losing the only person who still called her grandma. And she was about to fight back in a way nobody expected from a 71-year-old woman sleeping on a bench. Julian found out about the DHS letter the same day Helen received it. Clara told him, not out of kindness exactly, but because Clara was the kind of nurse who believed doctors should know when their decisions had consequences beyond the operating room. "You should know," Clara said, standing in the doorway of the call room where Julian was pretending to review charts. "They are looking at taking the child. Foster care." Julian set down his tablet. "What?" "DHS opened a case. The grandmother has no legal guardianship, no housing, no income verification. They are considering placement." Julian felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had brought Helen into that room because it was the right thing to do. He had not considered that doing the right thing could trigger a chain of events that might separate Helen and Lila permanently. He thought about calling a lawyer. Then he realized he did not know any family law attorneys. He thought about calling the hospital social worker. Then he realized the hospital social worker was probably the one who had filed the report that triggered the DHS review in the first place. Then he thought about legal aid. The Legal Aid Society of New York City has existed for over 140 years. It is the oldest and largest provider of free legal services in the country. They handle more than 300,000 cases a year, housing disputes, immigration hearings, criminal defense, and family law, including custody battles for people who cannot afford private attorneys. Julian called them in the afternoon. By early evening, he was on the phone with a woman named Denise Freeman. Denise was 34, a family law attorney who had grown up in the foster care system herself, bounced between 6 homes before aging out at 18, put herself through college and law school on scholarships, and sheer refusal to be defined by her circumstances. She specialized in kinship custody cases, grandparents raising grandchildren, aunts raising nieces, the informal family arrangements that hold communities together, but that the legal system often treats as invisible. "Tell me about the grandmother," Denise said. Julian told her everything: the bench, the many long weeks, the notebook, the heart rate improvement, the DHS letter. Denise was quiet for a moment. "You said she kept a notebook. Every day for many long weeks. Medications, temperatures, behavioral observations. She recorded everything." "That notebook," Denise said slowly, "is the best evidence of caregiving I have ever heard described in a custody case. Most of my clients are lucky if they can produce a school enrollment form. This woman built a medical log from the outside of a building." They met the next day. Julian, Denise, and Helen, sitting on that same bench because Helen had nowhere else to go, and Denise was not the kind of lawyer who needed a conference room to do her job. Denise looked through the notebook page by page. She asked Helen questions, not legal questions, human questions. Who enrolled Lila in school? Helen. Who took her to the doctor for checkups? Helen. Who braided her hair, packed her lunch, and walked her to the bus stop every morning? Helen. Who sat with her when she had nightmares? Helen. Who knew that Lila's favorite color was yellow, that her favorite food was applesauce, and that she was afraid of the dark? Helen. Here is what most people do not understand about guardianship in America. Millions of grandparents are raising their grandchildren, about 2.7 million according to the Census Bureau. But the majority of these arrangements are informal. No court order, no legal paperwork, just a grandmother who stepped in when a parent could not. And because there is no legal documentation, These grandparents exist in a gray zone. They cannot make medical decisions. They cannot enroll children in school without jumping through bureaucratic hoops. They cannot sign permission slips or access school records or authorize emergency treatment. And when the state comes looking, they have no legal standing to say, "This child is mine." Helen had raised Lila for 6 years without a single piece of official paper confirming what everyone in her life already knew. Denise began building the case. She pulled Lila's school records from PS 47 in Baltimore, where Helen had enrolled her. Attendance records showing Helen signed Lila in and out every day. Emergency contact forms listing Helen as primary guardian. A letter from Lila's first-grade teacher saying Ms. Whitaker was the most involved and dedicated caregiver she had encountered in 12 years of teaching. She pulled medical records, every well-child visit, every vaccination, every sick visit, with Helen's name on every form and Helen's signature on every consent. She gathered character references. Lila's Sunday school teacher, the pastor at Mount Zion Baptist Church, where Helen volunteered in the food pantry, 2 neighbors from the shelter who wrote that Helen was the most devoted grandmother they had ever seen, and a former colleague from Garrison Elementary who had known Helen for 28 years and described her as the kind of woman who never stopped showing up for children. And then Tasha appeared, not in person, but by phone. DHS had contacted her as the biological parent, as they were legally required to do. Tasha was in a residential treatment facility upstate, 6 months into a 12-month program. She was sober. She was trying. But she was not ready, and she knew it. Denise spoke with Tasha for 45 minutes. It was a difficult conversation. Tasha loved her daughter. She said that 3 times. But she also said the truest thing she had ever said. "My mama is Destiny's mother. I gave birth to her, but my mama raised her. I am not in a place to take care of anyone right now. I just want Lila to be safe, and she is safest with my mama." Tasha's statement was helpful, but her existence also complicated the case because legally, a biological parent's rights take precedence over a grandparent's, even an absent parent, even an addicted parent. The court would have to consider Tasha's status before granting Helen formal guardianship. It added time. It added hearings. It added layers. And time was something they did not have. Because while Denise was building the legal case, Julian was gathering medical evidence, and Helen was sitting on a bench waiting for permission to see her own granddaughter. Lila was getting worse. Dr. Okoro called Julian into her office on a Tuesday afternoon. She closed the door. She did not sit down. Neither did he. "The echocardiogram from this morning shows significant decline," she said. "Ejection fraction has dropped further. We are running out of options with medication alone." Julian felt his chest tighten. "What are you recommending?" "Ventricular assist device. Temporary mechanical support. We give the heart time to rest and recover. If it responds, we can wean her off the device. If it does not, she goes on the transplant list." AVAD, a ventricular assist device, is a machine that essentially takes over the pumping function of the heart while the damaged muscle tries to heal. In children, the procedure carries risk, bleeding, infection, stroke. But in Lila's case, the risk of not doing it was worse. "When?" Julian asked. "Sooner if she declines further." "But there is a problem." Julian already knew the problem. "We need informed consent from a legal guardian. Helen is not legally recognized yet, and Tasha is in treatment upstate. Can we reach Tasha by phone?" "We tried. The facility has restrictions on outgoing communication. Her counselor says she may be available later in the week, but later might be too late." This is where the law and medicine collide in the ugliest possible way. A child is dying. A procedure exists that could save her. A grandmother is sitting 20 feet away who would sign any paper, agree to any risk, do anything to save that child's life. but the law does not recognize her hand as the hand that can hold the pen. An emergency guardianship order was the option Dr. Okoro laid out. In the state of New York, when a child requires urgent medical intervention and no authorized guardian is available to consent, a court can grant temporary emergency guardianship. The process is designed to move fast, 24 to 72 hours. A judge reviews the evidence, determines that the child's welfare is at immediate risk, and grants a temporary order allowing a designated adult to make medical decisions. But even fast in legal terms means paperwork, hearings, and documentation. And Lila's heart was not operating on legal timelines. Julian walked outside. He found Helen on the bench. She was knitting. The yellow scarf was almost finished, now long enough to wrap twice around a small neck. He sat down next to her. "Lila needs a procedure," he said. "A device to help her heart." Helen's hand stopped moving. "When?" "Soon. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the next day." "What kind of procedure?" Julian explained it in simple terms. A small machine would help pump blood while Lila's heart rested. It was not a transplant. It was a bridge, a way to buy time. Helen listened. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she asked the question she already knew the answer to. "They need me to sign for it." "Yes, and they will not let me." "Not yet. We are working on it. There is a court process, emergency guardianship. It can happen quickly." Helen looked up at the hospital. 4 floors. Room 412. Somewhere behind that glass, her granddaughter's heart was failing. She set down the knitting needles. She stood up. She walked to the ICU entrance. The glass door was locked, as always. Helen pressed her palm flat against it, the same gesture, the same glass, the same hand. But this time, Lila was not pressing back from the other side. Lila was in a bed connected to machines, her small heart struggling to do the one job it was designed to do. Helen stood there with her hand on the glass and spoke to a granddaughter who could not hear her. "Hold on, baby, Grandma's coming. I just need them to let me in." The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning. Emergency session. Family court. Downtown Manhattan. Denise had filed the petition the previous evening, and the court had expedited it because a child's life was on the line and the clock was not waiting for anyone. Helen arrived early. She was wearing the best clothes she had. A pair of black slacks she had kept folded at the bottom of her plastic bag for months, creased from storage but clean. A white button-down shirt the shelter manager had lent her that morning when Helen explained where she was going. The shirt was slightly too big. Helen had rolled the cuffs twice to keep them from covering her hands. She had combed her hair and pinned it back. She had cleaned her shoes with a wet paper towel in the subway bathroom. She looked like what she was, a 71-year-old woman who had spent many long weeks on a bench and was now standing in a courthouse trying to prove she deserved to take care of the child she had already been taking care of for 6 years. The courtroom was small, not like courtrooms on television. No jury box, no gallery full of spectators. Just a judge's bench, 2 tables, a court reporter, and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. Denise sat at one table with Helen. At the other table sat the DHS attorney, Gerald Watkins, mid-40s, organized and professional, doing his job. Not a villain, just a man with a file and a legal obligation to argue that Helen Whitaker did not meet the state's criteria for custodial fitness. Judge Eleanor Grant entered, 60 years old, silver reading glasses. She moved with the efficient calm of someone who had seen thousands of these cases and understood that behind every file number was a family being pulled apart. "Counselor," the judge said to Denise, "present your petition." Denise stood. She was precise and focused, the way lawyers are when they know the evidence is strong, but the stakes are too high for confidence. "Your Honor, my client, Helen Whitaker, is petitioning for emergency temporary guardianship of her granddaughter, Lila Whitaker, age 6, currently in the pediatric ICU at Manhattan Children's Hospital. Lila requires an urgent medical procedure, a ventricular assist device implantation. Without a legal guardian's consent, the hospital cannot proceed. Lila's biological mother, Tasha Whitaker, is currently in a residential treatment facility and cannot be reached in the required time frame. Ms. Helen Whitaker has been Lila's primary and sole caregiver for 6 years. Denise placed the notebook on the table. This is a record of Ms. Whitaker's daily documentation of her granddaughter's medical condition, written from outside the hospital where Ms. Whitaker was denied entry due to lack of formal identification and housing. I also submit school enrollment records, medical visit records, character references from educators, clergy, and community members, and a written statement from Lila's biological mother confirming Ms. Whitaker as primary caregiver. Gerald Watkins stood. Your Honor, DHS acknowledges Ms. Whitaker's involvement in the child's life. However, the petitioner is currently without stable housing, without verifiable income, and without any prior legal recognition of guardianship. The department's concern is whether the petitioner can provide adequate long-term care given her current circumstances, Denise responded. Your Honor, we are not asking for permanent custody today. We are asking for emergency temporary guardianship so that this grandmother can authorize a procedure that may save her granddaughter's life. The question before this court is not whether Ms. Whitaker has a house. It is whether she has been this child's parent in every meaningful sense of the word. Judge Grant looked at the notebook. She picked it up. She opened it to the first page and began reading. The courtroom went quiet. Not the uncomfortable silence of waiting, but the heavy silence of something being weighed. Helen watched the judge turn the pages. Page after page, each one written in Helen's shaking hand. Each one a day she showed up when the system told her she did not belong. The judge paused on a page. She read it again. Then she looked up. Ms. Whitaker, would you like to address the court? Denise leaned toward Helen and whispered that she did not have to speak, that the evidence was strong, that sometimes it was better to let the paperwork talk. Helen stood up anyway. She did not have a speech. She did not have notes. She had her hands folded in front of her, and her voice, which was steady in the way that only comes from having nothing left to lose except the one thing that matters. Your Honor, I do not have a house. I do not have a car. I do not have insurance. But I have many long weeks of sitting outside that hospital because I could not leave her alone in there. I have 6 years of making sure she ate before I ate, slept before I slept, smiled before I worried about anything else. I do not know the legal words for what I am to that child, but Lila knows. She calls me Grandma, and Grandma never leaves. She paused, not for effect, but because she was trying not to let her voice break. My granddaughter is upstairs in that hospital right now, and her heart is giving out, and the doctors need someone to say yes. Go ahead, save her. I am that someone. I have always been that someone. I am just asking you to let me be that someone on paper, too. Helen sat down. Judge Grant removed her glasses. She set them on the bench. She looked at Helen for a long moment. Then she looked at the notebook one more time. This court grants emergency temporary guardianship of Lila Whitaker to Helen Whitaker, effective immediately. Ms. Whitaker is authorized to make medical decisions on behalf of the minor child. A full custody hearing will be scheduled within 30 days. She paused. Ms. Whitaker, get to that hospital! Helen did not shout. She did not cry. She did not collapse into relief the way people do in movies. She looked at the judge and said 2 words. Thank you. Then she turned to Denise and asked the only question that mattered. Can I go to her now? She does not like being alone at night. They gave Helen the consent form in a small room on the 4th floor. Julian was there. Dr. Okoro was there. A surgical nurse stood by with a clipboard, ready to move the moment the signature was on the page. Helen sat at the table. The form was 2 pages long, printed in small type, full of words like ventricular, anticoagulation, thromboembolism, words that described what could go wrong. Words that belonged to a world Helen had never been trained to navigate. But at the bottom of the second page, there was a line. And next to that line it said, "Guardian's signature." Helen picked up the pen. Her hand was trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what that signature meant. For many long weeks, she had been no one, unverified, unauthorized, a woman on a bench. And now, with one stroke of a pen, she was Lila's legal protector. The person the system finally recognized as the person Lila had always known her to be. She signed. The letters were uneven. The H leaned too far to the right. The W trailed off at the end. It was not a clean signature. Helen pressed her lips to the paper, just for a moment. Then she looked up at Julian. "You take care of her," she said. "And then you bring her back to me." A ventricular assist device is a mechanical pump. It does not replace the heart. It helps it. Think of it as a partner that takes over the heavy lifting while the damaged muscle rests and tries to heal. In children, the device is smaller, more delicate, implanted through surgery that requires opening the chest. The success rate in pediatric patients is roughly 60 to 70%. Good odds, but not certainties. Not when the patient is 6 years old and weighs 41 pounds and her heart has been struggling for nearly 2 months. Lila went into surgery in the afternoon. They wheeled her down the hallway on a gurney that looked enormous compared to her small body. Helen walked beside her, holding her hand until they reached the double doors of the operating suite. "This is as far as you can go," a nurse said gently. Helen knelt down next to the gurney. She pressed her forehead against Lila's forehead. She whispered something that only the two of them heard. Then she stood up and let them take her granddaughter through those doors. For the first time in many long weeks, Helen was inside the hospital legally. She sat in the surgical waiting room, a real room with chairs, a television, a coffee machine, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot instead of looking up at the building from a bench below. She sat in that room the way she had sat on the bench, upright, still, hands in her lap. Except now she held the notebook. The surgery lasted 6 hours. Julian came out twice to update her. The first time, 2 hours in. The device is being positioned. Everything is going as planned. The second time, 4 hours in. The heart is responding well to the support. We are closing up soon. In the evening, Darius appeared in the doorway of the waiting room. He was off duty, wearing street clothes. He held a paper bag with a sandwich and a cup of coffee. He set them on the chair next to Helen. Helen looked at him. "I am sorry I used to chase you away," Darius said. "I did not know." Helen picked up the coffee. She held it in both hands the way she always did. "You were doing your job," she said. "I was doing mine." Darius nodded. He stood there for a moment, then turned and left without another word. Later that evening, Julian came through the door a third time. He was still in his surgical gown. His eyes were tired, but he was smiling. "She is out. The device is working. Her numbers are already improving. She is going to recovery now. You can see her in about an hour." Helen opened the notebook to a blank page. She picked up her pen, and she wrote, "Today they let me in. I held her hand. She is going to be okay. We are going to be okay." She closed the notebook. She held it against her chest. And for the first time in many long weeks, Helen Whitaker cried. Not the quiet tears of someone holding it together, not the polite tears of relief. These were the deep, shaking, whole-body sobs of a woman who had carried an impossible weight across an impossible distance and had finally finally been allowed to set it down, to set. Lila woke 12 hours later. The room was quiet. Morning light came through the window. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. The ventilator had been adjusted. She was breathing more on her own now, the device in her chest doing the work her heart could not yet do alone. Helen was in the chair beside the bed. She had not moved. She had not slept. She was holding Lila's hand the same way she had held it that first night Julian brought her in. The same steady grip, the same stillness. Lila's eyes opened slowly, blinking against the light, confused the way children are when they wake up in hospitals surrounded by machines, uncertain where the dream ended and the waking began. She turned her head. She saw Helen. Her eyes went wide. "Grandma, I am here, baby. You are inside. I am inside. I am right here." Lila's fingers tightened around Helen's hand. Her bottom lip trembled, not from pain, but from something bigger than pain. "You did not leave. I never left. I was right outside the whole time." And then Lila said something Helen was not expecting, something that changed the weight of every single one of those long weeks. "I know," Lila whispered. "I could see you from the window every day." Helen's breath caught. She stared at her granddaughter. "What?" "The window in my room. It faces the front of the hospital. I could see the bench. I could see you sitting there. Every morning when I woke up, I looked out the window and you were there. And every night before I fell asleep, I looked and you were still there." Helen's hand was shaking. "Lila, why did you never tell the nurses? Why did you not ask them to let me in?" Lila's voice was barely audible, "Because I was scared that if I told them they would make you go away. They would move you somewhere I could not see you. And I needed to see you, Grandma. Even if I could not touch you, I needed to know you were there." A 6-year-old girl had been protecting her grandmother the same way her grandmother had been protecting her, from opposite sides of a window. One keeping watch from a bench below. The other keeping watch from a bed above. Both holding on to the only thing they had left. The knowledge that the other one was still there. Still close. Still refusing to leave. Helen pulled Lila's hand to her lips and held it there. She did not speak. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said through many long weeks of silence, many pages of notes, and many nights of choosing not to leave. What happened next inside that hospital was not a miracle. It was not a fairy tale ending brought about by a wealthy stranger or a sudden windfall of cash. It was something slower, quieter, and in many ways more meaningful. It was a policy change. Dr. Okoro brought the data to the medical board 2 weeks after Lila's surgery. She did not make an emotional argument. She made a clinical one. She presented Lila's case numbers, the many long weeks of restricted visiting, the stagnant cardiac function during that period, then the night Helen was present, 12% improvement in ejection fraction, stabilized heart rate, reduced agitation, improved sleep patterns. And after Helen was granted legal access and remained at bedside, continued steady improvement leading to successful device implantation and early signs of cardiac recovery. "One patient," Dr. Okoro told the board. "One case. I am not claiming this is a clinical trial, but I am asking you to look at what we already know from the research and tell me why we are not acting on it." She cited the studies, published, peer-reviewed in journals that every member of that board had read at some point in their careers. Research from institutions across the country showing that unrestricted family presence in pediatric ICUs leads to better clinical outcomes. Lower rates of delirium, shorter hospital stays, reduced medication needs, improved patient satisfaction, lower parental anxiety, which in turn reduces cortisol exposure for the child. The major pediatric hospitals that had already moved to open visitation models were seeing the results, Not in theory, in practice, in real numbers, in real children who recovered faster because the people who loved them most were allowed to be in the room. Our current policy, Dr. Okoro said, treats family as a disruption. The evidence says family is a treatment. Julian presented his report next. He had titled it, "The Case for Family-Centered ICU Care," and had spent 2 weeks writing it, not as a defense of what he had done that night, but as a proposal for what the hospital should do going forward. He documented Helen's case without using her name. He cited the research. He proposed a pilot program. The model was straightforward. Any patient in the pediatric ICU could have one identified primary caregiver granted 24-hour access, not based on insurance, not based on housing status, not based on whether the person had a government-issued ID or a formal custody document. Based on one thing, can you verify that this person is part of this child's life? The verification could come from school records, medical records, a social worker's assessment, even testimony from the patient if the child was old enough to speak. The point was to remove the barriers that kept people like Helen on the wrong side of a glass door while their children lay alone in beds 4 stories up. The board debated. Some were supportive, some were cautious. Legal raised concerns about liability. Administration raised concerns about logistics. How do you manage infection control with around-the-clock visitors? What about security? What about the other patients? And then Nurse Clara Goodwin stood up. Nobody had expected that. Clara was the one who had filed the report. Clara was the one who had followed the rules. Clara was the embodiment of protocol, the living reminder that systems exist for a reason. "I filed that incident report," Clara said, "and I would file it again because rules matter. But I also stood in that doorway and watched a child's heart rate stabilize the moment her grandmother touched her hand. I have been a nurse for 31 years, and I have never seen a medication do what that woman's presence did in 15 minutes. She paused. I followed the rules, but the rules were not designed for people like Helen Whitaker. And if we are not willing to change rules that harm the people they are supposed to protect, then we are not a hospital. We are just a building." The room was quiet. The board approved the pilot program 6 weeks later. Manhattan Children's Hospital became one of the first in the state to implement a caregiver access policy that did not require proof of insurance, proof of housing, or formal legal documentation. It required proof of relationship, proof that someone cared enough to show up. The medical community began to take notice, not because of one viral story or one billionaire's donation, but because the data supported what Helen Whitaker had demonstrated with nothing but a notebook and a bench. That love is not a luxury in medicine. It is an intervention. And the people we exclude from the healing process are often the ones the patient needs most. 4 months after the surgery, they removed the device. Lila's heart had healed enough to pump on its own. Not perfectly. She would need checkups for years, medication, monitoring. But the muscle was working. The blood was flowing. The 6-year-old girl who had almost died in a hospital bed while her grandmother sat on a bench outside was going to live. Denise completed the permanent guardianship filing 3 weeks after the emergency order. The full hearing took less than 40 minutes. Judge Grant reviewed the case, noted that DHS had withdrawn its petition for foster placement after Helen secured stable housing, and granted permanent legal guardianship of Lila Whitaker to Helen Whitaker. Helen walked out of that courtroom holding a piece of paper that said what Lila had known her entire life, that this woman was her family, that this woman had the right to make decisions for her, that this woman belonged. The apartment came through a Section 8 housing voucher. Denise's office had connected Helen with a social worker who specialized in grand family cases, and that social worker had navigated the waiting list, the paperwork, the inspections, the bureaucratic maze that stands between a homeless person and a front door key. It was a one-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a brick building in Jamaica, Queens. Small. The kitchen had a window that faced a parking lot. The bathroom tile was cracked in one corner. The hallway was narrow enough that Helen could touch both walls if she stretched out her arms. It was the most beautiful place Helen had ever seen. She moved in on a Saturday. She did not have much to move. The rolling suitcase with the broken wheel, the plastic bags, the box of crayons, the knitting needles, and the finished yellow scarf, and the notebook. Helen made the bed first. She smoothed the sheets tight the way Mama Pearl had taught her. Hospital corners, pillowcase tucked clean. She placed the box of crayons on the small desk by the window next to a stack of drawing paper she had bought at a dollar store with the first money she did not need for food. Then she took the notebook to a framing shop 2 blocks away. She asked the man to frame it open to the final page. He looked at the page, looked at Helen, and did not charge her. She hung it on the wall above the kitchen table. The handwriting was shaky. The ink was smeared in places from rain. But the words were clear. Today they let me in. I held her hand. She is going to be okay. We are going to be okay. Lila came home from the hospital on a Wednesday. She walked through the front door slowly, still weak, still careful. Her chest sore from the surgery scar that was fading but not gone. She looked around the apartment. She touched the wall. She looked at the kitchen. She looked at the bedroom. She looked at the crayons on the desk. "Are we home, Grandma?" "We are home, baby." Helen did not become wealthy. There was no surprise inheritance, no lottery ticket, no billionaire stepping in with a check. She lived on a modest monthly pension. Lila was covered by Medicaid. The rent was subsidized. The groceries came from careful budgeting and the food pantry at Mount Zion Baptist, where Helen had started volunteering again. It was not a fairy tale. It was a Tuesday. But it was theirs. 1 year after the night he found Helen on that bench, Julian Hayes stood in the lobby of Manhattan Children's Hospital next to a new sign. It was small and tasteful, mounted on the wall beside the information desk. The Ruth Calloway, a family bridge program, connecting families to housing, legal aid, and social services. Because no one should have to choose between being with their child and having a place to sleep. He had named it after his grandmother. The woman who worked 2 jobs, died on a laundry room floor, and never got to see what her grandson became. Julian had spent 16 years carrying the guilt of not being there when Miss Ruth collapsed. He had spent 16 years trying to make something of himself the way she asked. And for the first time, standing in that lobby, looking at her name on a wall in a hospital where families would be helped because of what she taught him, he felt like he had actually done it. The program was simple. When a child was admitted to the pediatric ICU and the family was identified as housing insecure or lacking legal documentation of guardianship, a social worker from the family bridge team would intervene immediately. Not after discharge, not after the crisis, but during it. They connected families with emergency housing, with legal aid attorneys who could file guardianship petitions, with food assistance and transportation vouchers, and the 100 small things that fall apart when you are spending every hour of every day trying to keep a child alive. Julian ran the program alongside his clinical duties. It was more work. It was always more work. But it was the kind of work that made the rest of it bearable. Every time he lost a patient, every time the machines won and the body did not, he could walk into that lobby and see his grandmother's name and remember why he stayed. Helen was the program's first volunteer. She came to the hospital every Tuesday and Thursday, not to the ICU, but to the lobby. She sat in a chair near the entrance with a cup of coffee and a composition notebook, and she waited for the people the system was about to overlook. She could spot them instantly, the grandmother in the hallway who looked like she had been sleeping in her car, the grandfather pacing outside the ICU door in the middle of the night, the aunt who had driven 4 hours and did not know how to ask for a visitor badge. Helen saw them because she had been them. She would walk over, sit beside them, and say the same thing Julian had said to her on that bench a year earlier. "I know how this feels. Let me help." She showed them how to talk to the nurses, how to ask for the social worker, how to keep a notebook. Because documenting your child's condition gives you something to hold on to when everything else is falling apart. She connected them with Denise at Legal Aid. She told them about Section 8 and Medicaid and the grand family support programs that most people had never heard of. And sometimes, when a grandmother was sitting outside a hospital at night because the system would not let her through the door, Helen would sit beside her and say the words that Mama Pearl had passed to her, the words she had carried through poverty and grief and many long weeks on a bench. A child does not need to know she is poor. She just needs to know she is loved. And love means showing up every single day. Julian watched Helen work from across the lobby one afternoon. He watched her hand a notebook to an elderly man who had been sleeping in the waiting room for 3 nights. He watched her explain the visiting policy in simple terms. He watched her put her hand on the man's shoulder and say something that made him nod and sit up straighter. He thought about Miss Ruth, about the folded sheet they found in her hands, about the kitchen table where he did his homework every night, about the promise he made and the long, winding, painful road it took to keep it. Help people who look like us. People nobody else is going to help. He looked at Helen across the lobby. She was laughing now, showing the old man something in her notebook. And Julian felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt like his grandmother was proud. 3 years later, in a classroom in Queens, 3rd grade, PS 112, Lila Whitaker sat at her desk. She was 9 years old now, taller, stronger. The scar on her chest was hidden under her school uniform, but she sometimes touched it absent-mindedly, the way one touches something that reminds one of where one has been. She had her grandmother's wide smile and her mother's sharp cheekbones and a laugh that still sounded too large for her body, though her body was catching up. The teacher had given an assignment. Write about your hero. Most of the kids wrote about athletes or pop stars or characters from movies. One boy wrote about his father, who was a firefighter. One girl wrote about her older sister, who had taught her to ride a bike. Lila wrote about a notebook. My grandma did not have a house, but she had a notebook. She wrote about me every day for many long weeks because she said if she could not hold my hand, she could at least hold my story. She sat outside the hospital every single day and every single night. Even when it was cold, even when it rained, even when they told her to leave, she did not leave. She never left. She said that is what love does. It pays attention. My grandma is not famous. She is not on TV. She does not have a lot of money. But she is my hero because when everybody said she could not be with me, she found a way to be with me anyway. She wrote it down so I would know. And I know. I always knew. Because I could see her from the window. The teacher read it after class. She read it twice. Then she put it in an envelope and sent it home with a note that said, "This is the most beautiful thing a student has ever written in my classroom." Helen read it at the kitchen table that night while Lila was doing homework in the bedroom. She read it once. Then she held the paper against her chest the way she used to hold the notebook against her chest on that bench. The same gesture. The same quiet weight of being seen by the one person whose eyes mattered most. Somewhere in a small apartment in Queens, a 74-year-old woman is making dinner for a 9-year-old girl. The notebook sits on the wall in a frame. The final page is open. The handwriting is shaky. The ink is smeared. But the words are there. The same words that carried them both through the longest weeks of their lives. Today, they let me in. I held her hand. She is going to be okay. We are going to be okay. Helen Whitaker was never invisible. She was just standing somewhere the system was not designed to look. This story is fictional. Helen, Lila, Julian, and the others are characters created for this narrative. But the issues in this story are not fictional. They are painfully, urgently real. Myocarditis in children is a real condition. It can follow a common viral infection. It can be life-threatening. And it is one of the leading causes of sudden cardiac failure in otherwise healthy young people. The grand family crisis is real. Right now, nearly 2.7 million grandparents in America are raising their grandchildren, many without legal custody, without financial support, and without anyone in the system acknowledging that they are doing the hardest and most important job there is. The debate over ICU visiting policies is real. Hospitals across the country are still figuring out how to balance security and infection control with the growing evidence that family presence improves outcomes. Organizations like Generations United are fighting every day for grand families to be recognized and supported. The Legal Aid Society provides free legal help to people who cannot afford an attorney. The National Alliance for Children's Grief supports families navigating loss and illness. These are real organizations doing real work. If this story moved you, look them up. I wrote this story because I keep thinking about all the Helen Whitakers out there right now. Grandmothers sleeping in cars, on benches, in shelters, just to stay close to the people they love. The system was not built for them, but they show up anyway, every day, in the cold, in the rain. With nothing but a notebook and the stubborn, unbreakable belief that their grandchild should not have to be alone. If this story made you think about your own grandmother, or about someone in your life who showed up for you when the world said they did not qualify, hold on to that. That is not just a memory. That is proof that love does not need paperwork. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it touched you, please consider supporting organizations that help grand families and vulnerable children. And if you know a grandparent raising a grandchild right now, share this story with them. They need to know they are not alone. Until next time, take care of each other, especially the ones the system forgets. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is simply to stay.